Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the authors and editors discuss news and events with a splash of history. Our host today is Dan Masterson. Joining him is Jim Dunnigan, well-known military author and the Dean of Wargaming. Also, joining today's show is columnist and author retired Colonel Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought we'd talk a little bit about what's been going on over the past year in the different places around the world. Austin, I know your expertise is Africa. I thought we'd start there. What's been happening in Africa over the last year as far as conflicts go?
Oh, gosh, I'm an expert in Africa. Okay. Poor me. No, there are many people who know far more about the continent and its conflicts than I do. The thing is that after 20 years of writing about predominantly Central Africa and Southern Africa to some degree, I did pick up a few things. Well, you've got the land of constant conflict called Congo. It's a state that never was. It constitutes a very large and wealthy failed state. If at one time I counted up and I came up with anywhere between 12 and 18 wars inside the boundaries of Congo. Now, I understand it's as big as Western Europe, just about the same size as Western Europe in terms of square miles. That is also, that total at the time depended on what you consider to be a war. But if your tribe, like Ahima versus the Lendu in northeastern Congo, if your one tribe is bent on exterminating the other, it's a war, even though it may not look like it in Washington, D.C. As far as I can tell, Congo still has a half dozen conflicts that are like that, primarily tribal, even though the one that goes on between in eastern Congo, north-south Kivu, Ituri provinces has an overlay of interstate conflict with Rwanda. Mozambique is a quote-unquote Islamist war, but there's a tribal dimension to it as well. The conflicts going on on the western side of the African continent, still problems in the Ivory Coast. Nigeria depends on how you slice it. It's a predominantly Islamic north, Christian animist south. Same kind of divide you have actually in Sudan, to a degree in other Sahel countries. And the Islamists have roots in other West African Sahel or countries, Mauritania as an example, Niger. Nigeria has a prize, all the oil, and it's particularly in southern Nigeria. But that's it's religion, but also tribal power, and as poet Petrarch said, ambition, anger, as are the enemies of peace. And you certainly see that in a place like Nigeria, Nigeria has a lot going for it. Fairly well-educated population, particularly in the south, and then petroleum, natural gas resources. Now, if you want to move back into Central Africa, the Central African Republic is still in chaos. Okay, the French have all but withdrawn. There's still Russian mercenaries there, Wagner, whatever its current name is. All of its diamonds and mineral resources. Looks like Wagner's running as something of a criminal cartel on behalf of the Kremlin, and there's spillover from that goes into southern Sudan and also in the Congo. Congo Republic, Brazzaville, which is on the north side of the Congo River, has a slow and continual civil war that's been afflicting it for 6-7 decades. And then if you move north into the drier sub-Saharan and Saharan areas, like I said, I've already mentioned Mauritania and Mali, Libya has, and I'm sure Jim will talk more about in detail, is still as something of a frozen conflict, but it's like Tripolitania versus Cyrenaica, which the east is Cyrenaica, Cyrene, the west Tripoli, Tripolitania. I mean, applying the old Roman names for the area. And you move finally over to the Nile. we'll go from downstream upstream. Egypt still has issues with Islamic radicals. And then you move into Sudan, which is in a huge civil war being fought between the quote unquote the two Islamic factions. I didn't say Islamist. They are really, it's a army civil war. One group is predominantly the Sudanese military formal, and the other is there was a paramilitary that has its roots in the old Janjaweed. If you remember the Janjaweed from the attacks in Darfur to try to destroy the Darfuri rebellion in the 1990s, early 2000s, and the Janjaweed were pretty effective at tribal genocide. They're there. The Rapid Support Forces, RSF, is the way you'll see that in English language reports. The descendants of the Janjaweed, and then you get it into South Sudan, which has reached something of it's reached exhaustion really in 2015, 2016 after its civil war erupted in 2013. And it was another tribal war, primarily between the Dinka and the Nur, over who was going to control South Sudan, which has oil resources. But you want to talk about a place that could be different, because surprisingly, in many ways, it's got a higher than expected level of literacy, particularly among the Dinka and the Nur, both Christian tribes. But they can't sell their oil because the major pipeline runs north through Sudan, through Khartoum, and then on over to Port Sudan, where they put it on the oil on oil tankers. The war between the Rapid Support Forces and the quote-unquote Khartoum government disrupts the oil flow. So arguably, this is a minor fact in some ways, but it's also a major fact. They have about 120 to 150% inflation in South Sudan every year. Their money's worthless, and they really live, since oil exports are 90 to 95% of the government's income, and they can't export it. There's no money for anything, and it's completely dependent. South Sudan is on outside aid, but you have trouble getting aid to it since it's landlocked, and you got Ethiopia and Kenya and Uganda, and then Sudan and Chad on the other side. And it's all with some degree of conflict, internal conflicts. Ethiopia with its issues with Somalia. Basically, Ethiopia has recognized Somaliland, Dan, which as a separate country. And the Somalis say, no, we won't accept that. And Ethiopia says, we'll negotiate with you. But Eritrea, right now, and Somalia are thinking of forming a pact to defend themselves against Ethiopia. And the Eritreans are saying that the Ethiopians want to grab the port of Assab, which at one time Ethiopia controlled on the Red Sea. Recall the Great War between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which was World War I in the escarpment and the sands and the mountains. It was that was the late 90s. You've got that being held temporarily in abeyance, and if we drop down to Somalia itself, you still have their war with Al-Shabaab, Islamist group that has its fingers in Islamist wars in Uganda, Islamist terrorist groups. Most of them say that they're loyal to the Islamic State or ISIL, ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call it. But running back through Uganda and Kenya and even getting into Congo, where you have a group that says it's the Islamic State in Central Africa, which also connects down to Mozambique, which claims it's the Islamic another ISIS faction in Mozambique. There just isn't much peace around the continent. Even in Botswana, the success case has a new government. They don't have a war going on there, but there's certainly political conflict. And South Africa, I could talk about on another program. Could it degenerate into a civil war? Outside possibility, because of the corruption of one of the political parties, astonishing corruption. And if you want to say a place on the planet has a lot going for it in terms of natural resources, South Africa is certainly one. The same thing applies to Congo. So I guess I've just off the cuff given you a little tour. I kind of left Tanzania out, but it has to deal with an Islamist faction. And poor Burundi and Rwanda. Rwanda is locked into the fight over the Congo's Kinshasa government over parts of eastern Congo where the Banyamulenge Tutsi tribe, and Rwanda's run by a Tutsi tribal government. That's one of the issues there. You don't see Tutsi land on the cartographers' maps, but Tutsi land exists as far as the Tutsis exist. As far as the Tutsis are concerned, I guess you got a continental tour there down to that work.
Yeah, that'd work. Now, Jim, one of the interesting things about Africa is, at least sub-Saharan Africa, is China is mixed up in a lot of that, right?
They want the resources, especially in Congo. A lot of the fighting in eastern Congo is over who will control the natural resources. And China has been putting a lot of money into the country. They want to build railroads and roads and pipelines and whatnot so they can extract those natural resources. I mean, they'll pay for them, but God knows, as Wilson pointed out, God knows where the money will go. It's a foreign bank account, I suppose. But the Chinese are very active. They want the natural resources, and they're willing to deal to about anything they have to in order to get it. China has other problems. It was recently revealed that China has far fewer people than previously thought. It's about 800 million. The economy's a mess. Inflation, basically mismanagement by the government, and they're trying to recover from that. I mean, it's like the how should I put it? A housing bubble they've created for themselves, Evergrande and a few other operations, and this is basically bringing the Chinese economy to a halt, and it's not going to move forward anytime soon. I also made a note here about Syria. Iran, well, Syria too. Iran, as we know, had tried to attack Israel. That failed miserably. The Israelis struck back, and they basically not only destroyed the air defense systems, but they destroyed the missile production systems, the factories that manufacture the fuel, the casings, and what have you. So now Iran is really disarmed. The only missiles they have left, ones they have been sold to Russia or tried to use against Israel. So Iran is in a very bad shape. Israel, of course, has done very well for itself this year, mainly because two of their enemies, well, their primary enemy, Syria, basically collapsed. This guy Golani, with 30,000 men, overran the country. He is now trying to establish a government. It's a Sharia government, surprise, surprise. And he's running into resistance from the Syrians. Well, the Assads may have left. The Syrians are still there, and they don't want to go back to Sharia. They didn't have it under the Assads, and they don't want it under Golan, who's got a new name, Amram or something like that. So it's the same old, same old. It's disappointing. We thought getting the Assads out would be good for Syria, and just the opposite has happened. Israel, like I said, has been winning, as it were, all around. Since Syria is neutralized now, even though it's got a Sharia or whatever government, it is in chaos. The Golani only had about 30,000 men. That's not enough to pacify the entire country. So some of the old warlords are sticking their heads up out of the sand and saying, oh, okay, let's take something. And you still got the Kurds, who occupy about 40% of Syria, and they are resisting, intrusions by the new government. The Kurds may be the lifeline for Syria, because although the Turks would like the Kurds gone, they haven't been able to dislodge them. Turkey, of course, encouraged and supported the invasion of Syria. They cleared out the Assads, but now they're trying to pick up pieces. They're negotiating with the Russians to get them reestablished in their Tartus naval base and Hindenham air base. The Russians are considering that. For the moment, the Russians have decamped to Libya, where they're setting up temporary stations. Now, the Russians have long been in Libya, as well as the Turks, but the Turks are concerned about what's going on in the Middle East, because the Islamic terrorist groups are now more active inside Turkey, as well as in Syria and other places. The Islamic terrorists are staying away from the Israelis. The Israelis have expanded into Syria a bit, a buffer zone, as they call it. They took the highest mountain in the region, I think what the name it was, but it's a great place for an electronic monitoring base, so you can monitor everything in that part of the world, into Lebanon, and all throughout Syria and what have you. The Syria has also, of course, destroyed Hezbollah. Hezbollah is trying to revive several $100 million that Iran is trying to deliver to the remnants of Hezbollah so they can get reestablished. And that money is now blocked. I mean, it's floating around somewhere, but it's not gotten to Hezbollah yet. And the last thing the Israelis want is to rebuild Hezbollah. So that's what's going to keep Israel going. Wait, I got a note here on Syria. What else have I got? Wait a minute. There we go. Oh, Yemen. Yes, we've already covered Syria with HTS now trying to run the place. But Yemen is still a mess. You still got the Houthi clan militia firing rockets into the Red Sea. The United States, apparently, this may change with Trump. The Pentagon is telling Trump, look, if you want to calm down Yemen and ease up on the pressure for the shipping going through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, you basically got to do a major bombing campaign. Now, there have been a few bombing runs against the Houthis in Syria. I think the B-2 stealth bomber, that went in there a couple of times. And if the United States goes along with a major campaign, they could probably knock out most of the weapons. A lot of the weapons were destroyed. In fact, a lot of the Iranian weapons in the Middle East were destroyed. The Israelis destroyed most of the weapons caches in Syria. I think they got about 80% of them. And so that basically disarms any group in control of Syria that wants to basically attack Israel or anyone else. The Israelis are also blocking any further shipments from Iran. As I pointed out, they've already got in and bombed all the missile production factories, which is something they should have done a long time ago, because as long as they just, bombed air defense systems and what have you, the Iranians can still build more missiles and keep firing into Israel. But you're going to see that destruction of the missile production and infrastructure having an impact in 2025, because it's basically going to be fewer missiles being shipped out of or fired out of Iran. And you're going to see all the people like Hezbollah who are relying on support from Iran, scratching the ground looking for something to fight with. They can fight with rocks and sand, and the Israelis can deal with that. But they are basically doing a lot less damage when they haven't got any missiles or any other weapons to fire. Other than that, it looks like it's going to be fairly quiet at 2025. People simply haven't got anything to shoot at each other with. And Israel, especially Israel, is intent on preventing any reconstruction of the weapons building operations to keep things quiet. So that may provide some interesting consequences for this year. If they do quiet things down in the Middle East, that'll be a major accomplishment.
Dan, could I make a comment on that?
Yeah, go right ahead.
The Israelis have really smashed 2/3 of Iran's triangle of fire, ring of fire. I mean, that is Hezbollah, Hamas, and they damaged the Houthis, in part because the Israelis have been relentless in attacking those who attack them. That's what that's what Jim's alluding to about things may tamp down or quiet down this year in 2025, is because of the Israelis' determination and their success in prosecuting the war, particularly against the Hezbollah, but also against Hamas. They're closer in enemy, and then also the Houthis. As for that strategic bombing campaign on the Houthis, I know in a strategy talk, I want to say it was in January of 2024, may have been December of 2023. We talked about that, and I described how you would go after those Houthi launch sites and the Houthi storage sites, essentially in this valley that comes inland from Hodeidah, which is the port on the Red Sea, and the Houthis basically control that port. The Israelis have struck it. The U.S. forces, I'll say, actually coalition forces. There's some other nation ships out there in that operation, supposedly sanctioning the Houthis. Also have participated in some of, definitely in the air defense. They may have participated in a couple of the strikes on land targets, but they unleashing a flight, dozens and dozens and dozens, scores of 2,000-pound JDAMs will tamp down the Houthis. No, there's always going to be somebody in there that survives, and a weapons dump that'll survive. And using the typical Saddam Hussein type response is, we survived, therefore we won, which is BS. No, you lost. That would very, very good chance it reopens the Red Sea and the Suez Canal to commercial shipping. And so that, what is it now, Jim? Some 80 to 90% of commercial shipping has to go around Africa to Cape of Good Hope. Yeah, I mean, you've cut transit times by 2 weeks and lowered maritime insurance rates, and suddenly you've taken an edge off of inflation in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. So it could be done. Will Trump do it? I don't know. Jim was speculating that he might have a change, and he would.
Well, yeah, he's a pretty practical guy, and if he looks at that and says, "Look, if you basically continue disarming Iran, and they are basically disarmed now, if they have no missiles to ship to the Houthis, and then the Houthis stop shooting, they have basically been using up a lot of their stockpiles. A lot of them were bombed out by the Americans." And if there's no more coming in from Iran, and that's going to be the case because Iran isn't producing anymore, it's going to be quiet. No bang if you got nothing to fire, nothing to go bang with. And that's going to be an interesting situation.
Oh, look, I tell you, it's in Egypt's interest because they rely on the canal for a lot of income.
Yeah, $10 billion a year.
Yeah,
and so they were hurting when the Red Sea was a no-go zone.
Yep.
So now let's talk about Asia a bit. We've got the everlasting war there with Pakistan and India, but there really hasn't been much movement there at all, right, Jim?
No, there's one province in the north there, Kashmir, which they've been fighting over since 1948, who really owns it and what have you. And that's gone pretty quiet. The Pakistanis have a lot of internal problems. They've had political problems. They have economic problems. They got problems. The Indians, not so much. The Indians are getting better. The Pakistanis are getting worse. It used to be the Pakistanis were much more on the ball militarily than the Indians. But that has shifted. The Pakistani economy has collapsed. There's nobody to supply them with weapons. The Chinese are really reluctant to send any more weapons, and have been for over a year to Pakistan. And the Indians are well armed, better armed than they've ever been, in the past. The Indians were always ignorant when it came to military affairs. That's a whole story we can cover sometime. But because their enemies had basically self-destructed, the Indians are relatively much stronger. Now, the Indians are not aggressive. They're facing China up north on the border. They got Pakistan. But other than that, they have nobody, giving them a hard time. The Indian Ocean is very much the Indian Ocean, and there's nobody really going to mess with them. The Indians are not aggressive. They don't want to conquer anybody. They have a huge country, 1 billion people. They are now the most populous country in the world, since China has basically admitted that there's only 800 million Chinese, and that's shrinking because of the one-child policy, an aging working population and what have you. So India is flourishing while China is floundering. And that's going to make for a big change. Like I say, the Indians are not aggressive, but they want to maintain their borders and basically work on their economy, which is what they're doing right now. So that's going to have a major impact. The other thing you have to realize, that the Indians always realize, why are the Chinese so technologically advanced over India? Well, the problem was India never paid attention to education. The Chinese did. The Indians basically favored keeping a lot of people in subsistence agriculture, which means you got a lot of people who are uneducated, not very economically productive, and the Chinese were doing just the opposite. So the Chinese, I think, had 5 or 6 times the GDP of India. The Indians are among themselves, we should do something about that, and they're doing something about it. So by this time next year, we'll be able to report if the Indians did make actual progress against the Chinese threat. Again, there's only one province, Arunachal Pradesh in the northeast, that the Chinese would like to grab. But if the Indians are strong enough, and of course the Indians have nukes, as do the Chinese, so there's always a nuclear threat. But, the Chinese could, worm their way in there and say, oh, we occupy it now, what are you going to do? But they haven't been able to do that. And they may be less capable to do it, in 2025 because of the shifting economic sands. The economic situation basically decides a lot of it. It's like the old saying goes, amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. And the Indians have gotten much better at logistics.
So now one of the things is that the Koreas are sort of interesting, and that North Korea has injected itself into the conflict in Europe with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, did they inject themselves?
Go ahead.
They inject themselves, or were they bought into the conflict?
Yeah, they're mercenaries.
Yeah, they're bought in. Oh, that's it.
Right.
And they're taking a beating. The North Koreans are, and some of them are getting away. The Ukrainians want to capture some of them alive to get a better insight into what they're up against. And I believe they have, but they're not talking about it, because any Korean who basically gets captured and becomes an asset for the enemy, the Koreans will go after his family. And they told that to these guys before they sent them. Says, remember the homeland, remember your families. Sort of a veiled threat. But it's a very real threat. And so the North Korean mercenaries are taking a heck of a beating. I mean, they already suffered several thousand casualties. That's only out of 12,000, so a quarter of them are already dead or wounded. And of course, the Russians are using them as, for mass assaults, the usual nonsense. See, something else is going on in Ukraine you got to be aware of, is the Russians have run out of soldiers. That's why they had to bring in the Koreans. And now they're running out of Koreans. They've run their economy into the ground. So that's going to have interesting implications, because the Ukrainians have managed to keep their economy going because they get a lot of foreign aid from NATO countries, especially the United States. The United States has basically assured them more economic aid. Trump is glad to give that. He just doesn't want to get involved in the war. He said he would stop the war. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how that works out, what exactly he's going to do. But the Ukrainians have won. They're intact, and the Russians are in tatters. I mean, their economy is a mess. They got that ball bearing catastrophe. The railroads are basically shutting down because they're not getting any more ball bearings from Western Europe. They imported all the ball bearings they need for their rail cars, and so they got thousands and thousands. The satellite photos have shown this. You got thousands and thousands of rail cars basically stranded outside Moscow and other major cities because they can't move them. So, it's going to be interesting times in Russia in 2025 because they got an economic catastrophe. If they can't keep their railroads moving, they can't keep food moving, resources moving to the factories or food moving to areas that don't produce enough food of their own. So, look for spectacular tragedy in Russia in 2025 because that's already been set up in 2024. And in 2025, it's going to climax, so to speak.
So now one of the interesting things, Jim, is the Philippines has settled way down. That used to be something we reported on quite a bit over the years, but it seems like that's just it. Has the Duarte government been that effective?
Well, what's happened is the rebels in the South have basically been worn down. They've worn down and worn out. They've been killed. The Filipino government, Duarte and his predecessor, it's Marcos now, the son of the original Marcos.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't.
But, and he has basically made a deal with the South. Well, his predecessor started it, and he basically finalized it, where they have a federal state in the South and as an Islamic state. Now, it's funny. It's an Islamic state where most of the Filipino Muslims are, but it's a majority Christian area. So, and I think that's one reason why the Philippine government went along with it. Said, oh, sure, you can have that area as your state, but you got all those Christians, and they're not about to convert. So, that's sort of like a collar on any ambitions the southern, Islamic population might have. So that's basically calmed down. They still have some problems in the South China Sea, and they had some run-ins with the Chinese Navy. But the Chinese are basically looking for control over the South China Sea, which is not a major problem for the Filipinos until, and the Chinese are doing this, they try and encroach on the fishing areas. The major, potentially there's natural gas and oil resources in the South China Sea, but that's more of that apparently is up the north coast of the Philippines, which is farther away from China and easier to protect. But in the South China Sea itself, the Chinese are trying to assert, ownership of waters that are not economically productive. And so the Filipinos have managed to hang on to the money, and they're still disputing. I mean, basically, the Chinese are wrong. I mean, we pointed this out before. They have no claim on the South China Sea. The name, forgetting the name, especially surrounding the Philippines. The territorial waters, which go out, 400 or so kilometers from the nearest mainland, covers most of the valuable stuff. And I think the United States has told the Filipinos, we will back you up if the Chinese try to seize those valuable, waters and land areas. So the Chinese are basically coming up against a potential pushback from a U.S.-Filipino coalition. So again, that's something we have to watch in 2025, how that develops. The Chinese do not want a war with the United States, but they do not want to give up their, ambitions in the South China Sea. So something's got to give.
The thing is, though, that China has been successful in encroaching on the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, the EEZ. They're in there, created artificial islands, and turned them into air bases and localized sea bases. And they're already claiming it as sovereign Chinese territory. They have successful aerial.
They declared it a new municipality.
That's right. That's further. Yeah, that's further north. But they've already got these really created bases. And look, the Filipinos in 2016 got that ruling from the Hague's Court of Arbitration, based on the UN Convention, Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, that the court recognized that 98%, that's the figure they use, really almost everything the Philippines complained about what China was doing was correct, and the Filipinos were right. The Chinese did not own that territory. It's not Chinese territory to exploit, but they were doing it. And it included, as Jim, as you said, the fishing rights, mineral rights, but really position was key to it. They'd come in and taken these sea features. I think that's the term that was used in it, if I'm going on memory here, and turned them into artificial islands. So they've got military facilities on some of these, and they've played the same game with the Vietnamese. China's been a successful, aggressive, expansionist imperialist in the South China Sea. And their whole game is to create these facts on the ground. Then they come up with all the legal malarkey to claim this and claim that and invent a history. And what do? The history now is they've got air bases, sea bases, and really, we talked about this, Jim. I want to say 10 years ago on a strategy talk, and you pointed out that you put up some surface, strike missiles, anti-ship missiles on some of these positions, and you've essentially operating area denial against surface operations of an enemy fleet. What I've been writing about from the get-go, though, is they're working their way down to the Strait of Malacca, little by little, taking a sea feature, turning it into an air base, making a claim here while they were already doing it with Brunei, so they get into definite oil territory when they get down there to Brunei. But they're marching down to the Straits of Malacca. And I don't say this is some conspiracy theory. Take a look at the map.
They are, but the problem is they do not want to fight. The United States has made it clear that we will back up the Filipinos, and we've already had American ships going in there. For example, the areas they declared as Chinese, foreign aircraft and ships are supposed to ask for permission to enter. The Americans have very openly ignored them. American aircraft, military aircraft, or even, non-unarmed aircraft go into that zone, and they're told just ignore them. The Chinese will say, who are you? You must have permission, and we just sail right through. The Chinese traditionally do not want to be the ones to fire the first shot. So it's basically a war of nerves. And so far, the United States is backing up the Filipinos and saying, well, you just ignore them. They're not going to shoot first, and if they do, we shoot back with a lot more, and they know it. So I think the Chinese are playing a game of bluff, and the bluff isn't working anymore.
Okay, yeah, agreed, Jim. But is a water cannon shot from a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, and we've talked about this. Those Coast Guard vessels are destroyers. Really, they are. They're destroyers.
On vessels, yeah.
Oh, yeah, and they're you point out many times. Dan, I'm doing this because Jim's absolutely right in calling these Chinese Coast Guard vessels what they are. They're Navy ships. This is where they arm them, the way they crew them. They just paint them white and call them Coast Guard vessels. Water cannon attacks on Filipino fishermen, Filipino local merchantmen, and they even make ramming runs. Is that a first shot? Comes close. I'm not saying it is.
The Chinese will come close, but they won't cross the line. That's been their strategy for years.
Yeah,
they do not be the one to fire first.
They've now got
water cannon don't count.
All right, but Jim, they won't cross the line. That moved from the 9-dash line to the 10-dash line. They added a 10th dash, and it's up to the east of Taiwan, and that's what they're peddling around now as Chinese waters. And that's what part of their quote-unquote legal diplomatic line of operation to expand Chinese control of land and sea in the Pacific, into the Pacific Ocean and the South China Sea. I know the South China Sea is part of the Pacific Ocean, but it's looked at as inshore littoral because it's between the Philippines and Southeast Asia, Indochina as it used to be called. And all right, they're claiming it. They're at least and proclaiming it. Now, I know they're hesitant to actually pull the trigger, but it's comes very, very close with what they've done with the Philippines.
Their policy as published is we will not fire first. And I don't think they're going to back off on that. Like I said, like I mentioned earlier, the Chinese have a lot of problems internally. Now, you could say, well, they're doing all this external stuff to make the people, look somewhere else. But Chinese people are already starting to, well, they're not already started, they're already doing it. They're getting the money out of the country. The American firms, the Western firms that were setting up in China are getting out, moving to Vietnam or Malaysia, whatever. And so the Chinese have a lot of economic problems. They can huff and they can puff in the South China Sea, but they're not ignoring the problems back home. And so a lot of what's going on in the South China Sea is for show. And if you don't basically ignore the show, it means nothing. And
I'm in complete agreement with you that the Chinese Communist Party's biggest threat is the Tiananmen Tiger, which is a way of talking about disgruntled Chinese people that are sick of being misruled. All right, so that is Beijing's biggest threat. It's the people.
So let's talk about maybe the last issue that we'll talk about in Asia, which is Taiwan. Austin, is there still a possibility of the Chinese going more aggressively after Taiwan?
Just despite what Jim said, understand that his read on the way China operates is I'm in complete agreement with. But my answer is yes, and it comes back to what's happened on several strategy talks. If you go back, Jim talks about here's the politics, what they're doing, and then I come back and look at it as a plans and operations officer and say, but you've got to look at the map, and then you've got to look at the force lay down, as you say, and look at, because that tells you about possibilities. Also, it also gives you a picture of what could become an intention. And the Chinese have built their Navy up. We write about it all the time. They're improving their air forces. They've got plenty of short-range and medium-range missiles. They even experimented with the missile drizzle attack on Taiwan in the mid-90s, 95, 96. We sent a carrier group in Taiwan. The Chinese backed off. But they have built the military forces for it. You see them now moving to, Jim, I forget the name of that new carrier, but it's really an amphibious warfare ship.
Oh, yeah, the LHC. Yeah.
No, we've had this stuff in there.
The 075 class, and they got one of the new 076 class, which is basically a drone carrier.
Well, all right. So, Dan, you see what I mean by I look at force laydown, and see also, I mentioned the 10th Dash, which is now, somewhere 100 miles east of Taiwan's eastern beaches. So it's a chunk out into the Western Pacific. And there's the quote unquote legal claim and diplomatic claim. And you've heard the Chinese Communist Party since 1949 call Taiwan the lost province because that's where the Kuomintang troops and the Shanghai Shek retreated from the mainland in 1949. You see what they do too to some of the outlying islands, like Matsu. Matsu is frequently cut off by sea from Taiwan by Chinese ships. It's to the northwest of Taiwan, closer to the Chinese mainland. And then Kinmen, as it's called now, it used to be called Quemoy. Understand? JFK and Richard Nixon debated defending those islands in the 1960 presidential campaign. And I've been to Quemoy, Kinmen, and looked through an old, now unoccupied bunker, and the mainland is, it looks close up. It might have been a mile and a half away from where this forward observation bunker was sited, and it's kind of a tourist trap now to walk through that bunker. And when I was there, let's see, that was 2002. Uh, I could see some people out fishing from an open rowboat out there, and the guide who was with me says, "Oh, they live over in Fujian, meaning Fujian province. They just row out in the middle of the inlet and they go fishing." He told me that the Taiwanese on Kinmen they do the same thing. That was 2002, and it's indefensible that Quemoy is. Like I said, Quemoy, Kinmen, same island, and that's what John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Nixon were talking about. Could you defend it? You couldn't defend it in 1960, but they haven't. Beijing hasn't moved on it, but it's built the capabilities to do it. It's built the capabilities to at least attempt an invasion of Taiwan. And Jim and I have talked about this several times. There are all kinds of ways to bottle the mainland Chinese up using sea mines, drones, submarines, and the like. There, with improved air and space defenses, there are all kinds of ways for the Taiwanese to defend themselves from communist Chinese missile attacks and air attacks. Well, one of the other things is there are really only two, maybe four, depending on how you cut it, beaches that you could land significant forces on in an amphibious assault. There's a map out there that that shows up every once in a while in the few remaining major newspapers, some of the defense magazines. There's one down south, and then there's one kind of up north. There's a beach actually on the eastern side that you could land on, but for the most part, Taiwan we've called it a porcupine. I mean, it's a piece of rock that's got rocky beaches, tough to land on, and then when you dig bunkers in it, the island becomes a big bunker. But Beijing had built forces to tackle that problem, built forces to assault the island. They talk, and Jim pointed this out, a lot of what goes on coming from Beijing is to talk tough and push a nationalist, outside forces threaten us, therefore we have to be belligerent. It uses that as an attempt to unify the Chinese people under their rule. Okay, it's show. At the same time, they built elements that could be used. And let's go back to January 2022. You were asking me about, well, similar program to what we're doing today. But what about Russia and Ukraine? Well, I came back and said the same thing. You look at the map, look at the force laid down, and what could they back up if this is their intent, if the Russians decided to launch an all-out conventional war. Understand there you still had a slow war going on in Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. And sure enough, Putin, being a madman and seeing weakness in the West, weak Western leadership, Biden administration, here's my chance. Does that occur in Beijing? Could they make the same mistake? As Jim said, we don't know what Trump's going to do. China doesn't know what Trump's going to do. And that's good. That's another reason for them not to do anything. Uncertainty as to what kind of response you're going to get from the world's most powerful country, in this case, the United States. So, do I actually think China's going to attack Taiwan? No, I agree with Jim, but I have to sit back and play, ops and plans officer. And, you call me in and you're the commanding general, Dan. Colonel Bay, what do you think? Take a look, take a look, take a look at their exercises. Also look at the fact that the Chinese are building up their nuclear arsenal, strategic nuclear arsenal. They're going to have as many warheads by, said 2032, maybe 2035. But the fact that they're doing it sends a capabilities message. So, is it over? No. Do I think it likely? No. Is it possible? Yes. So therefore, you have to be ready for it.
Let's swing over to the other hemisphere now. You wrote a little bit about Mexico, or you're going to be putting out a piece that covers all the stuff that we're talking about. But one of the items that caught my eye was what you said about Mexico. What's happening there in
Well,
the state?
the cartels have taken over about a quarter, no, 20% of the country. They're one of the largest. I think they're the fifth largest employer in the country. So Mexico still has a serious problem, especially in Sinaloa province, with the cartels basically establishing their own government. Now, this is still a shadow government, but the Mexicans have a major problem with the country being basically forced into a civil war. The Mexicans have deployed there, especially the Marines, which are less corruptible than the army soldiers, and but Mexican population, the people, are becoming fed up with the dominance of the drug lords, as it were, and the impact they're having upon the economy as a whole. So that's liable to explode. The drug lords can basically push it so far, and then they come up against the nationalist attitude that we're not going to be subservient to narco thugs over in Sonoma. So that's liable to come to a head in 2025. If not then, in the next few years. I mean, it's moving that way, and the Mexicans are losing patience with the government, and especially with this drug, movement that is humiliating for the Mexicans. Being the source of all this junk, and a lot of it leaks into Mexico. So a lot of Mexican families have personal grudges because one of their kids or even the adults get addicted to this stuff, and it's poisoning. The poison basically is becoming very personal, and that's going to have repercussions. The Mexican history is full of situations like that, where the thugs or whatever push and push, and eventually there's a big pushback, and then the cycle starts all over again.
But let me make a comment on that. In Sinaloa, correct me if I'm wrong on the month, Jim, but I think it was last September that you had an cartel war break out.
Oh yeah,
in Sinaloa, Isn't that right? And it was factions within the quote unquote Sinaloa cartel.
Yeah.
But also other cartels, and it was. I'm not sure what all of the reasons for this particular battle, but
Money.
It wasn't necessarily control over a route into the United States, but was who was going to have a de facto political control over the larger towns in Sinaloa. Isn't that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. That's an anarchic criminal war is what it is.
Well, they always had that. Whenever any cartel got too big, it would start breaking up as factions began to fight for more of whatever that particular faction held. But they crack up. But the business keeps going. Nobody has gone so far as to trying to interrupt the flow of drugs. It's just a question of who controls it and who profits from it the most. So they're basically fighting over money.
So now one of the things that's going to happen is some of the sources of the cartel's economy are going to dry up. Trump is going to try to shut down the border, and the cartel had been making a lot of money off of, smuggling bodies, more or less, and also the fentanyl coming in.
Well, the Mexicans have started, the gangs have started setting up fentanyl manufacturing operations in the United States. So, Trump can go after that as well. You don't want these guys, basically setting up business in your own country. I mean, that eliminates all the smuggling problems and creates other problems because once they're manufacturing drugs in the United States, those drugs leak out of these manufacturing facilities, and all of a sudden you find out towns and villages, for miles and miles from this place are becoming, drugged. The kids and some of the adults are starting to get all these drugs, and that becomes a major problem for Texas, which is where most of it is happening. And Texas is building its own wall, waiting for the federal government to start doing it, because the problem is largely in Texas, and Texas figures, well, this is when Biden was in charge, and Trump is apparently going to be different. But the Texans are saying, if you won't take, the federal government won't take care of it, we'll take care of it, and that's moving at pace. So it all depends on, we'll know in 2 weeks what exactly the new Trump government is going to do. If they get behind Texas, it might be bad times, for the drug gangs if they got the United Front, federal and state, blocking their access to the United States.
Yeah, again, there's a China connection there in Mexico with the fentanyl, where apparently they're supplying.
It comes from China, yeah.
Right. But the things that make up fentanyl are coming from China.
Yeah, but there are other sources developing. Apparently, like I say, the drug gangs are starting to manufacture it in Mexico. So they're getting some of the components from China, but the Chinese don't want to basically send them components because sending them fentanyl is much more profitable than sending them components so they can make it themselves. So the Mexicans have apparently found other sources, either in the United States. I mean, a lot of that, anything that's built in China is built in the United States, especially chemical industry. So, I mean, that's a story that will come out in 2025. More details of how that's going on. The Mexicans don't want to be dependent upon China, and the United States doesn't want any more drugs flowing in from Mexico. So it's going to be an interesting year.
Yeah, there have been some other small flare-ups south of the border, but nothing major, right?
No. I mean, Venezuela is still in chaos, but
Right.
it's sort of a quiet chaos.
Right.
Maduro got himself elected, even though he lost the election. There was rioting and what have you. I mean, his days are numbered, as it were. I mean, the opposition grows and grows, and eventually it'll overwhelm him. But they got all that oil being shipped to Cuba and Mexico and anybody else they have to bribe. But eventually that comes to an end. They're being squeezed.
We're going to see, we already are seeing, a major power struggle, though, over the control of the Panama Canal, because, as we pointed out before, China has a quote-unquote port, operates a port on the Pacific side and one on the Atlantic side of the Panama Canal. And that's one of the things Trump is objecting to when he makes the statement, we want to take over the canal again. That's him setting up a bargaining position and also saying, hey, this matters. Why don't you kick the Chinese out? That's, but that's, I see that become a shooting war? No. But that's a superpower struggle that's going to happen within this hemisphere. Another thing China has been trying to do, and is doing, is setting up facilities to build its electrical vehicles in Mexico and therefore get around quote-unquote sanctions and being able to take advantage of the U.S., Mexico, Canada, or Mexico, U.S., Canada, whatever the pact, the one that superseded NAFTA. And Trump says, you're not going to do that. You're not going to abuse and run around that agreement and sneak in and sell your ultra cheap subsidized electrical vehicles in the United States. That's another superpower conflict at economic and diplomatic levels. They become shooting wars? No. But I think there are significant points. There are significant points, and the Panama Canal is strategically important to the United States.
Yeah, another problem is that the electrical vehicles are a bubble that's eventually going to burst.
I agree with you, Jim.
They are not, how should I put it, economically viable. And you've already seen the Tesla, market collapse. And people, once people get an electric vehicle, they realize this doesn't work. I mean, it takes me, a long time to charge. There aren't enough charging stations. You don't get much mileage with these damn things. So what's the point? Well, basically, the point was all hype. And the hype is wearing thin.
Well, I want to make a comment about Venezuela, though. But it's a show by Maduro threatening next door to go into Guyana's oil fields.
Yeah,
But it is something that could be done by the Venezuelans. What would happen? They'd be at war with the United States,
exactly.
Great
Monroe
Britain,
Doctrine.
and they don't need it. Maduro uses that to galvanize support for his regime, but it does make interesting headlines. That's for sure.
And which oil fields are those again, Austin?
Yeah, they're in that
Yeah,
in Guyana, but they
Guyana, okay.
yeah,
southeast of
I'm trying to remember the
Venezuela.
name of the river and jungle area they're in, but they're good sized fields according to the what's published in the oil journal.
Yeah, and
Okay.
largely been undeveloped until now.
Right. So maybe the wrap this all up, we talk about when the U.S. is going to invade Greenland.
Never.
You take that one, Jim. I do have a comment on it, though.
That's all Buster.
Yeah.
Dan, do you know the United States has basically been protecting Greenland since about 1940 or 41? And then definitely it's World War II. And there's a pact with Denmark that dates, I say 51 or 52, something like that, where we're more or less totally responsible, the United States, for defending Greenland. And that's the other. This makes great headlines. Is well, why would we buy it? They forget the United States bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1960. Now, okay, it's not an invasion, but because if there was an air base that was a quote unquote co-op air base right at the southern tip of Greenland, where British, Canadian, and American long-range patrol aircraft were out looking for U-boats during World War II, and also trying to find German landing spots in northern Canada and Greenland, dropping off weather teams or the like, because the Nazis wanted advanced warning on storms coming from the Arctic. But Denmark was overrun by the Nazis anyway. Well, Trump is saying something like we'll buy it or whatever. It plays into the competition over the Arctic and Arctic resources in defense of the northern border of Canada and the United States. But to a major degree, I'd say to a near absolute degree, the United States is already defending Greenland.
Yeah. It's during World War II. I mean, Iceland is right off the eastern shore.
Right, that's exactly right.
And between Iceland, Canada, and the United States, nobody else has any interest in Greenland. And there's not
the Chinese say they do, and so do the Russians.
Well, they say they do, but like I say, we're going to be running the Chinese out of the port.
I know.
Taking control of all over the world, not just in Panama. That's something else that has to be dealt with.
Look,
right.
During the Cold War, the U.S., we were very, very interested in controlling what was called the Big Gap, Britain, Iceland, Greenland. Yeah. Why? To keep Russian submarines bottled up. That's why. So.
Right. So we mentioned it, and we'll really wrap up with this, is the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Basically, Jim, you see that just as it's got no more go there, right?
Yeah, the Russians have run out of troops, they've run out of money, their economy is in a shambles. Like I say, this year, we're liable to see an economic catastrophe in the Russian economy. Putin says, oh, it's not a problem. Well, it's easy for him to say because him and his buddies, oligarchs, doing fine. They have money. They have, if the electrical power system goes down, as is doing in many other parts of the world, they have their generators. But the Russian people are fed up. There are internal polls, and of course, via the internet, you can collect a lot of information, because the Russians have not been able to turn Russia into one big internet. Cut off from the outside internet. And there's a lot of unhappiness, that's a word, within the Russian, because prices are going up, inflation is skyrocketing, there's less money, there's less food, there's less everything. And this is a long Putin can't wish it away. He can say whatever he wants, but a lot of Russians are saying we don't need any more Putin. So, I mean, imagine a world without Putin.
Right.
Good
Well,
times.
and they're just not, the Russian people are not lining up to go into Ukraine to try to keep what they've got.
Well, there aren't enough military-age men left in Russia to be, mobilized, as they say, into the army. Millions have left. They fled the country, military-age men, legally or illegally, got Central Asia. I think the Finns are no longer letting them in, or maybe they are, but just not saying anything about it, because every Russian guy who gets out of the country is one less guy that can be mobilized into the army. So, like I say, that business of hiring Korean mercenaries is a sign of how desperate the Russians are for manpower. They've taken nearly 1 million casualties, dead, wounded, and desertion, what have you, so far. They have literally run out of manpower. I mean, that's what the North Korean soldiers are all about. And Putin is still telling his generals, keep attacking, keep attacking. And the generals are starting to say, attack with what? They'll throw rocks at them. Maybe they'll go back to catapults and tree buckets. I don't know. But
And
the Russians are on short rations, and the impact of that is going to hit in 2025.
well, and one of the possibilities there is right now they're frenemies with the Chinese, but the Chinese still have thoughts about going further north, especially in the
Yes,
Pacific.
that 200 years ago, that was Chinese territory. A lot of Vostok had a Chinese name, and and the Chinese are saying, we want our territory back. We've helped you guys out a lot. Help us out. Make China great again.
Right, make China great again.
And I've got there's a on point column of about 4 years ago dealing with just that, with all the names of the treaties and the like. But then the another sticking point is the Bolsheviks, when they took over in 1917, told the Chinese that yes, they'd be giving them back the land that the imperialist czar took illegally, but by 1925 that was forgotten. The Chinese
Right.
didn't forget. They hadn't forgotten. And look, largely Siberia is open space, uninhabited, and it's ripe for the plucking.
Well, increasingly, those eastern provinces are inhabited by Chinese.
Mhm.
Chinese came over as merchants, and now they started to say there are 1 million Chinese living in far eastern Russia. So they sort of infiltrate, and all of a sudden, you've got all these enemy civilians in your midst. And what are you going to do about it?
Well,
Right.
remember China, communist China, and the Soviet Union, where Russia's communist empire, went to war in what, 1968, along the Amur River?
Oh yeah,
River line?
yeah,
68, 69. They were shooting it out. That was one of the reasons Nixon thought there might be a chance to, the quote unquote opening of China, and he starts that initiative with Kissinger in
Well,
1970.
I think the Russians went to Nixon and said, "Hey, why don't we get together and nuke China
Yes, that's
to
right.
reduce the threat?"
And the
Uh,
Chinese knew the Russians had said that to us. So,
Yeah.
that's
And we
right.
said no. So maybe now the Chinese will come to us and say, "Hey, let's get rid of the threat in the Russian Far East and turn it back into the Chinese Northeast."
That's interesting. Yeah, so make China an Arctic nation.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, they already built icebreakers.
no, Jim, she says that all, or Shy, how you would pronounce it. Shy says that China's an Arctic nation, and so does the Chinese foreign office.
Yeah.
That's what
Turn
they
the
say.
Arctic again.
Which takes us back to Greenland, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Right.
All right.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up there and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Next month. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.